It's a celebration of America's freedom. Welcome to the Mark Scaringi Show. The Mark Scaringi Show is your place for a weekly discussion on making America great again. The important political and legal issues of the day, a celebration of the Constitution, and traditional American values. Mark is a practicing attorney, a former senatorial candidate, a Donald J. Trump-endorsed delegate, and a defender of the Constitution. His goal? To put America first. And now, celebrating America's freedoms, here's attorney Mark Scaringi.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Mark Scaringi Show. This is your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. This is where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. And if you'd like to enjoy some of the prior podcasts of this show, or to check out some great merchandise, or take a look and read at some of the columns, my more recent columns, published by Penn Live, the Harrisburg Patriot News, the American Thinker, and the Western Journal. In particular, the column that's just up today on the Trump tariff effect and Trump's tariffs in Mexico. And it's getting lots of clicks and comments on Penn Live and the other journals that I just mentioned. And you can also check out our website at themarkscaringishow.com. And thanks to my listeners from WHP 580 and iHeartRadio and viewers and commenters on Harrisburg 100 Facebook Live, welcome to the show. And today we're going to continue our discussion on President Trump's tariff proposal with Mexican imports and the deal that was just announced last night. And you'll recall that last week the president announced that he would impose a 5% tariff on the importation of all goods from Mexico unless Mexico made substantial efforts to reduce the flow of migrants into the United States. Now, the tariff was scheduled to rise by an additional 5% each month that the Mexican government was unable to satisfy the demands of the president. It would cap out at 25%. The threat by the president issued last week really sent shockwaves across the country, on Wall Street, of course, in the D.C. Beltway, and down in Mexico, where the president of Mexico responded immediately by sending a letter to President Trump in which he admonished and lectured the president on human rights, which I think is ironic coming from the Mexican president. And he also, the Mexican president, immediately dispatched his foreign secretary to Washington, D.C. to negotiate a compromise in an effort to thwart the president's plan to impose these tariffs. Of course, Mexico is so dependent upon exporting its products into the United States. We are their largest trading partner by far, by an overwhelming percentage. Mexican exports into the United States amount to about 80% of its overall exports. So clearly, the United States has the upper hand by a significant proportion in negotiating any trade deal with Mexico. And the president's threat to impose tariffs it has a significant effect on Mexico, its government, and its businesses, because they're so afraid of a U.S. import tariff on Mexican exports being sent over across the border into the United States, because they're so dependent on the United States consumer market. So the president got the Mexican president's attention immediately, and right away the Mexican foreign minister worked with Vice President Pence and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and trying to negotiate a deal that would satisfy the demands of President Trump, and apparently one has been reached. The president tweeted out last night and then the White House issued the U.S.-Mexico Joint Declaration. The president tweeted out that a deal was struck. Now, here are some of the basic and main points of the deal as described in a rather brief and somewhat vague U.S.-Mexico joint declaration. I think the first big takeaway here is that Mexico has agreed to deploy its National Guard throughout the country with priority given to its southern border with Guatemala. The Mexican government announced almost immediately after the president of the United States imposed or threatened to impose these tariffs. The Mexicans almost immediately announced they were going to add 6,000 National Guardsmen and put them down there on their border with Guatemala, because that's really the point of entry from so many of the Central American migrants from El Salvador and Guatemala and other countries in Central America. They're getting across Mexico's southern border and traversing across the country of Mexico, making their way up to the United States. So President Trump is saying if the Mexicans could do substantially more to stem the flow on Mexico's southern border, that would go a significant way in deterring overall the number of migrants who are making their way up into the United States or up to the U.S.-Mexican border. So this is a big step, according to the president and the White House, that the Mexican government has made. But I think perhaps an even more significant step is, according to the U.S.-Mexico Joint Declaration, asylum seekers crossing the U.S. southern border will be sent back to Mexico, where they will await adjudication of their asylum claims. Now, this has already started. The president had already earlier reached somewhat of a deal with the Mexican government to allow a certain number of these migrants to remain in Mexico while their asylum claim makes its way through the long and torturous process in the United States. And that's critical because it prevents these migrants from getting into the United States, filing their claim here, and then being immediately released into the U.S., where the overwhelming majority of them just never show up for their asylum hearing, and they just simply kind of disappear into the shadows of the United States. They become part of the permanent millions of illegal aliens residing in the United States. So it was very important that the president work with the Mexicans to nail down this more concrete deal that the Mexican government is going to, I assume, have all of these migrants stay in Mexico while they await adjudication of their asylum claims. The United States will immediately expand the implementation of this existing migrant protection protocol across the entire southern border. So what had started in parts and places of the border by an agreement to keep the migrants in Mexico apparently is now going to be expanded across the entire southern border. Now, this means that those crossings, the crossings across the U.S. southern border by these migrants to seek asylum, they're going to be rapidly returned to Mexico, and they're going to await their adjudication of their asylum claims there. And Mexico will now authorize the entrance of these individuals into Mexico while they await their adjudication. And Mexico has pledged as part of this deal to offer jobs, health care, and education to these migrants, these asylum seekers. And our president obviously hopes this will help keep the migrants in Mexico as opposed to crossing our border and entering the United States. We're going to talk more about the U.S.-Mexico deal on migration when we return from this brief commercial break. You're listening to The Mark Scaringi Show.
Now, more of Mark Scaringi on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Mark Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. This is where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. And today we're talking about this announcement from President Trump via Twitter last night, where he has reached a deal with the Mexican government to stem the flow of migration into the United States of America. You'll recall that last week the president issued an ultimatum, a threat, that he would begin imposing a 5% tariff on Monday on all Mexican goods exported into the United States, and that tariff would increase by 5% each month until it capped out at 25%, until and unless the Mexican government took direct action to substantially reduce the flow of migration across the U.S.-Mexican border. Well, that sent shockwaves around the country and on Wall Street and, of course, down in Mexico City, because Mexico is so dependent on its exports into the U.S. market. We are by far and away their largest trading partner. 80% of Mexican exports go to the United States of America. So the Mexicans are terrorized by the idea of U.S. Tariffs on imports. So the Mexican president, after admonishing President Trump about human rights, was quick to do whatever it took to strike this deal. The president announced the deal last night. There is a brief statement that was released that talked about the deal. The statement is somewhat vague. It would be nice if it would be a little bit more concrete, but we're talking about the major takeaways of the deal. And I'm interested to know what my listeners think about this U.S.-Mexico deal to stem the flow of migrants, and the president will indefinitely suspend the imposition of these tariffs that were, the threat of which were obviously so effective in getting the Mexican government to the bargaining table. But call in, let me know what you think, 717-540-0580. That's 717-540-0580. Do you think this deal is good for America? We're talking about, I think, the more important takeaways of the deal. I think probably the most important takeaway is that the Mexican government has agreed that asylum seekers crossing the U.S. southern border will be sent back by the United States to Mexico, where they're going to await adjudication of their asylum claims, and they'll wait in Mexico. And my listeners are aware, and those who are following this issue, that there is this migrant protection protocol that the U.S. and Mexican government have been following for some period of time, where a certain number of these Central American migrants have remained in Mexico. And apparently the big part of this deal is that protocol will be extended across our entire southern border. So it will cast a much wider and perhaps complete net. We shall see. And the Mexican government has also agreed to authorize the entrance of those individuals into Mexico while they await their adjudication of their asylum claims through the United States court process. And so that authorizes and legalizes the existence of those Central American migrants in Mexico. So they're going to have a lawful status now in Mexico as part of this deal that the president just announced last night. And the Mexican government will also offer jobs and health care and education to the asylum seekers. So those are the basic takeaways, in addition to the fact that the Mexican government has pledged to put 6,000 National Guard troops on its southern border with Guatemala. And so the question is this, and the president, of course, has agreed to indefinitely suspend the imposition of those tariffs. So is this a good deal for the United States of America? You're welcome to call in 717-540-0580 and let me know what you think. The president tweeted just this morning, about an hour ago, that Mexico will try very hard, and if they do that, this will be a very successful agreement for both the United States and Mexico. So that presents the question, do you think Mexico will try very hard? There are some skeptics who are suspicious of the kind of the desire of the Mexican government to actually do the heavy lifting that is involved here. There is I think a failure of this deal, and we'll talk about that in a little bit after we take some listeners' questions. One big part of this, of what the Trump administration was trying to accomplish with this deal, was getting Mexico to agree to become a safe third country designation. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a few moments after we take some listener calls, because I want to know what you think, whether this deal is good for America. You're welcome to call in 717-540-0580. We'll talk to Philip from Wiccanisco. You're on the Mark Scoringi Show. This deal that the president struck with the Mexican government, is it good for America?
Absolutely. This is not the Teddy Roosevelt era. So what he's doing, he knows what he's doing. Listen to the way the man talks, the way Trump talks. He talked to North Korea by putting it in a real estate deal term. Okay? I mean, this guy knows what he's doing. Every time he does I hear the CNN and the rest of these characters sitting there go, oh, it ain't going to work. Oh, it's Teddy Roosevelt all over again. It's nonsense. He's already won. He'll win the Chinese deal, too.
Yeah, it is remarkable to watch this president in action.
Brilliant.
We're so used to watching and observing presidents and U.S. senators and others talk about what they want to accomplish, in particular with foreign governments, and then it kind of always turns out that, well, the U.S. taxpayers are going to pay more, or the United States is making more concessions, and it's so rare that you actually see something, a deal struck that actually benefits the United States. This president brought the Mexican government to the negotiating table in about an hour by threatening the imposition of those tariffs. The Mexican president responded via letter immediately and said he's sending his foreign minister up to Washington, D.C. like that day. I mean, that's remarkable. When have we experienced that? Did we experience that during the Obama administration?
During no administration that I can remember in history, and correct me if I'm wrong, if anybody knows an administration where we actually pulled anything like this, let me know.
Yeah.
Let me know. And then the one with Korea was just as brilliant. He turns around to Kim Jong-un and he says, do you realize what a real estate position you were in?
Yeah, that is
brilliant. You're between Japan and you're between North Korea, two of the biggest manufacturers of electronics and componentry and everything. He said, you're right in the middle. He says, by the time he gets done, he'll be a Kim Jong-un tower in South Korea, and all this nonsense of war will be gone. I mean, it'll be amazing.
Yeah, and in this Mexican deal, the president used the ultimate leverage, and that's the imposition of these tariffs.
Right.
And it's something that a man who's been doing deals in the hard scrabble New York City real estate market for 50 years, he understands leverage. And I've never seen a U.S. politician, I've never seen them truly grasp and understand the use of leverage in doing deals.
Politicians don't understand leverage. Politicians understand, shall we say, B and S. That's it. They don't do anything else. This guy has been making deals with buildings. He's built buildings in New York. He looked across the street and he said, look at that pile of garbage that they call a park. And they've been trying for years. He turns it around, and with 6 months it took him, or less than a year, maybe a year, and he turned it into a beautiful, and he did it all at his own expense, and it benefited him too, as well as the city.
Well said, Philip. Thank you for your call. I want to take a few more calls before we hit a commercial break. We have Mark from Hanover. You're on the Mark Scoringi Show. Did the president strike a good deal for America or a bad deal?
Well, it depends on the answer to this question. I'm wondering if we agreed as part of this deal to pay more money to Mexico per asylum seeker that they're going to hold for us.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and the statement that was released is rather short and rather vague, regrettably, so I don't know the answer to that question. I know that in some earlier deals that were done with Mexico, we did pledge to contribute a couple of $1 billion, I believe, toward the economic development of those Northern Triangle countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. So I imagine there's probably going to be U.S. taxpayer dollars involved in this, if that's the way. That seems to be the way of the world and the way it always goes down, Mark. So we'll have to wait and see.
And I appreciate that, because I didn't see either the details, and I do understand if we maybe for every dollar we spend to keep them in Mexico, we're probably getting $10 back in savings from having them here. If maybe that would justify it. But yeah, I was just curious because I know we agreed to pay money in the past, and that was the one thing I kind of had a contention with.
Don't the U.S. taxpayers always ultimately end up footing the bill?
Yeah, it always cost us in the end.
Hey, Mark from Hanover, thanks for calling. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
We're going to take a brief commercial break. You're listening to the Mark Scaringi Show. Stay tuned. We'll be back right after this.
News Radio WHP 580, powered by AC Rimmer. Give us a ring. AC repair or replacement. Contact AC Rimmer. acrimmer.com. Let's get back to the Mark Scaringi Show on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Mark Scaringi Show. This is your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. You're welcome to call in 717-540-0580. That's 717-540-0580. Let me know what you think about the president's deal with Mexico that was announced last night. The president's very proud of it. According to Fox News, he's tweeting up a storm all day today, advocating and touting and congratulating himself and the Mexican president and his negotiators for striking a good deal for Mexico and the United States. And he's congratulating the president of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. That's quite a name. AMLO is his, I guess, his nickname. And we're talking about whether or not my listeners here on WHP 580 and iHeartRadio and those on Harrisburg 100 Facebook Live, whether you think this is a good deal for America. I wish there were more details on the deal. We've talked about some of the main takeaways in that the migrant protocol apparently is being expanded to include the entire southern border, the entire border between the United States and Mexico, whereby the Mexican government has agreed to essentially allow the United States to return these migrants to Mexico, keep them in Mexico, as opposed to allowing them into the United States, and then through catch and release, off they go, and you never find them again in the U.S., and they become part of the shadows, so to speak. They're coming in at $80,000, $90,000, $100,000 a pop each month, and so now we have the Mexican government that's saying, well, we can stop them from coming into the United States. We'll take them here in Mexico. We'll give them a lawful status where they can remain here in Mexico during the period of time that their asylum claim works its way through the United States courts. And the president and also the Mexicans have agreed to help find them jobs and of course, health care and housing and education and all of those things. But our listener, Mark from Hanover, he raises the question, are the U.S. taxpayers going to be paying for all that? The details don't tell us one way or another, but we shall see. U.S. taxpayers ultimately, in most cases, end up paying for everything, it seems to me. So that's a possibility. We just don't know at this point. But there was a big part of this that we apparently did not get as a part of the deal, and that is this safe third country designation that the United States has been wanting Mexico to agree to for quite some period of time. And the news reports that I've read indicated that the Mexican government rejected that request by the U.S. delegation that Mexico sign as a safe third country agreement with the United States. On a conference call last week, the conference call that involved the Chief of Staff in the White House and also the Secretary of Homeland Security, Kevin McAleen, the Homeland Secretary described the three main things that he wanted to see Mexico do. And so let's compare what the Homeland Security Secretary indicated were the three main points that he wanted Mexico to agree to the actual agreement that was released just last night. The Homeland Secretary said last week he wants more vigorous Mexican efforts to secure the border between Guatemala and the Mexican state of Chiapas. He said they need to step up their efforts on the border, on their border, and that is deterring these unlawful entries, this unlawful migration from Guatemala across the border and into Mexico. Now, the U.S.-Mexico statement that we talked about earlier in the show announcing the deal, it states this. It says Mexico will take unprecedented steps to increase enforcement to curb irregular migration, to include the deployment of its National Guard throughout Mexico, giving priority to its southern border. So it seems like the Mexican government did agree to priority number one established by the Trump administration when they began these negotiations last week. That's because the Mexican government announced, and actually it announced, I think, early on in these negotiations that it was sending about 6,000 National Guard troops to its southern border. Now, the second point that the U.S. Homeland Security Secretary identified as one of the main points that he wanted the Mexican government to agree to as part of these negotiations is he called for a massive crackdown on the organizations that help migrants travel through Mexico to the United States. The Homeland Security Secretary characterized these groups as transnational criminal organizations and said we need Mexico to crack down on these operations, many of which, he says, are operating fairly openly, with some involving commercial bus lines. And so we've all watched the news programs and the videos of the busing that was going on. Well, you'd see the migrants marching in line, hundreds or thousands of them. They'd get to a town, to a bus depot. Buses would pick them up and take them some part of the way. Of course, the migrants had to be clothed, they had to have shelter, had to have food, sanitation on the thousands of mile trek from the Northern Triangle across Mexico and up to the U.S. And so there was big money involved in financing this migration, much to the consternation of the Trump administration. And so the Homeland Security Secretary said that he wants a massive crackdown by the government of Mexico on these organizations, these transnational criminal organizations that were involved in some of this migration, and that he wanted the Mexican government to crack down in this area. Now, the U.S.-Mexico statement, what does it say? Well, it says Mexico is also taking decisive action to dismantle human smuggling and trafficking organizations, as well as their illicit financial and transportation networks. That's the statement. I wish it were more concrete than that. I'd like to know exactly what the Mexican government agreed to do that it hasn't already been doing to counter and deter and take down and dismantle human smuggling and trafficking organizations. Mexico has had a significant problem with human smuggling and trafficking. Obviously, drug trafficking is such a big and endemic systemic problem in Mexico. What are they going to do differently as part of this agreement that they haven't already been doing? Well, only time will tell. The third point that the Homeland Security Secretary identified last week when the negotiations started as a priority of the U.S. government is, and some are saying that this is potentially the most significant thing that the Mexican government could have done to really and truly stem and stymie and stop this massive migration of Central Americans into the United States under these bogus asylum claims. And we've talked a lot in prior shows, and I've written a lot about this in my columns about how the 90-some percent, 95, maybe even higher percent of these asylum claims are, of course, bogus and false. These Central Americans are not fleeing persecution by the governments of their respective countries based upon their political or religious or other beliefs. It's just false. They're just migrating northward for jobs and opportunity. And that is not an asylum claim. That's not a valid or proper asylum claim. So that's a big part of the problem, but that's a problem with U.S. law. And regrettably, we have a liberal federal district court and federal circuit courts, and we have liberal U.S. laws that are allowing this massive abuse of our asylum laws. But in any event, The third priority identified by the United States Secretary of Homeland Security is, he said, we want to align with Mexico on asylum. We need to be able to protect people in the first safe area they arrive at. Now, this appears to signal a desire to move beyond the current remain in Mexico policy, and at least we have established that the remain in Mexico policy is part of this deal. And we talked about that earlier in the show, that these migrants are going to remain in Mexico while their false asylum claim makes its way through the U.S. Court system. But it appears that U.S. negotiators wanted more than that. They wanted Mexico to sign what's known as a safe third country agreement. Now, this type of agreement would have Mexico agree that it's a safe place for people fleeing Central America, and thus when the Central Americans arrive at the U.S.-Mexican border, they would not be entitled to asylum hearings because they would have traversed through Mexico, which according to what the White House or the Trump administration wanted, was that Mexico would be declared a safe third country. So the idea of this agreement, and we have this agreement with Canada, by the way. The idea of this agreement, the way it works, is when those Central Americans illegally cross the Mexican border from Guatemala into Mexico, they've stepped foot in Mexico. And Mexico is now a declared safe third country. And as a result, that's where the asylum claims would be brought by the Guatemalans, the El Salvadorians, and the Hondurans. That's what the Safe Third Country Agreement is about. And so not only would the migrants from Central America remain in Mexico, but they would file for asylum in Mexico. And they would go through, they would file their bogus asylum claims in Mexico and let the Mexican government, the Mexican court system, and the Mexican taxpayers deal with hundreds of thousands of bogus and false asylum claims. And it keeps them in Mexico. And it doesn't give them the benefit and the privilege of requesting asylum in the United States. So this is what the Trump administration wanted. This was a big priority for them, and I think would have been the most significant gain for the United States had we coerced Mexico into signing a safe third country agreement. Apparently, they did not. And so that is an unfortunate part of this deal that we couldn't convince the Mexican government to agree to that. We're going to talk more about a deal between the United States and Mexico to curb migration into the United States when we return from this brief commercial break. You're listening to The Mark Scaringi Show. Hi, this is attorney Mark Scaringi. Every Saturday afternoon at 1, thousands of central Pennsylvanians listen to the Mark Scaringi Show on WHP 580. It's a program about state, local, and national politics from the point of view of putting America first. If your business or organization would like to reach my listeners, you can advertise on my show. Promote your business on the only weekend political show in central PA. Call 717-657-7770 and talk with Jason to promote your business on the Mark Scaringi Show.
Now back to the Mark Scaringi Show on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Mark Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. You're welcome to call in at 717-540-0580. That's 717-540-0580. We're talking about the deal the president just struck with the Mexican government to curb the migration of Central Americans into the United States and to enhance Mexican efforts to stop this flow of migration. And we're asking our listeners what they think, whether they think the deal is good for America. You're welcome to call in 717-540-0580 and let me know what you think. A couple of the big takeaways of this deal, we've talked about how Mexico has agreed to deploy its National Guard throughout its country with a priority given to its southern border where this problem originates. in the border between Mexico and Guatemala. The Mexican government has announced they're going to put 6,000 National Guards in the country and on the border to stop or stem the flow of migrants across Mexico's border and into Mexico, and ultimately they arrive on our doorstep and apply for asylum, and thus tie up the U.S. court system and expend lots of taxpayer dollars in dealing with the overwhelmingly amount of false and fraudulent asylum claims. A second big win as a part of this deal the president struck with the Mexicans is that it's the Remain in Mexico policy. The asylum seekers crossing the U.S. southern border will be sent back to Mexico, where they'll await adjudication of their asylum claims. And we've talked about how the migrant protection protocol that we have been able to reach with Mexico does allow for the Remain in Mexico policy to affect a certain portion of the migrants, but apparently, according to this deal, it's now going to be greatly expanded to include the entire border between the U.S. and Mexico. So this is a big win, I believe, for the United States government, for the rule of law in the U.S. and for the U.S. taxpayers, that hopefully now pretty much all of these migrants who make it to the U.S.-Mexican border are now going to be turned back, and they're going to remain in Mexico for the period of time that their asylum claim is adjudicated. So that's a pretty big step and a pretty big change or an expansion of the migrant protection protocol that has been put or that was put in place a while back. So we'll wait and see how that develops. And the Mexican government now, as part of this deal, has agreed to authorize the entrance of these individuals into Mexico to essentially make it lawful, legalize the fact that these Central American migrants will now stay in Mexico, to give them some sort of lawful status to remain in Mexico during the pendency of their asylum claim in the U.S. Mexico has also agreed to give jobs, health care, and education to these asylum seekers. Hopefully, the United States taxpayers won't be paying for that, but we shall see how that develops. But the point I'm making is there is a bigger, I think, a much bigger and more beneficial part of this deal, concession that we could have gotten from the Mexican government, or that we asked for from the Mexican government. Apparently, we couldn't get it because we didn't. Was the Safe Third Country Agreement. And this is an agreement that the U.S. has with Canada, and it's one that the Trump administration has wanted the Mexican government to enter into with us. And the Mexican government apparently refused, and that did not make it in the deal that was just announced. And the Safe Third Country Agreement would have required or would have declared that the Central American migrants who were seeking asylum, once they stepped foot in Mexico, and now that Mexico would have been declared a safe third country, that they would remain in Mexico and bring their asylum claim in Mexico. And that's really what I guess the biggest win would have been for the United States government, is if we could have gotten Mexico to agree to that. Because that would have solved the migration for asylum problem in its entirety, because that's where the migrants would have to bring their asylum claims, not in the U.S. Mexico apparently didn't agree to that, and so we're still going to have to process all of these bogus and false and fraudulent asylum claims, even though under the Trump deal, now the Central American migrants will remain in Mexico, which is a big win for the American people, in my view. It would have been an even bigger win had we convinced the Mexican government to declare itself and become a safer country by agreement with the United States. Apparently, that was not part of the deal. But in any event, let me know what you think. You can call in 717-540-0580. Let me know whether you think this deal was good for America, good for the American people, or did the Trump administration not go far enough? Would you have preferred to see the imposition of these tariffs occur on Monday and then be ratcheted up an extra 5% each month until they hit 25%? Do you think the Trump administration should have stuck to its guns and should have asked for more? For example, should it have refused to do this deal unless Mexico signed a safe third-party agreement with the United States? Call in 717-540-0580 and let me know what you think. Or you're also welcome to comment live on Harrisburg 100 Facebook Live. Now, the interesting thing about the president's tariff threats was the immediate and near unanimous condemnation it received from the entire D.C. Beltway establishment, of course, from Wall Street and naturally from the media. Trump's tariffs, his threat of tariffs, faced ferocious opposition from the Republican caucus in the United States Senate. We heard from farm state senators Joni Ernst and Chuck Grassley. They came out immediately in opposition to the president's threat to impose tariffs on Mexican imports. And naturally, Mitt Romney, a never-Trumper to the core, was opposed to the tariffs. And there was even talk there were enough votes in the Senate to overcome a presidential veto should the Congress pass a bill to strip the president of his authority to impose these tariffs in the first place. Other U.S. senators, such as Rand Paul, who has been close to this president, stated, I think the new tariffs are a bad idea, and I think there's a possibility there could be a veto-proof majority in the U.S. Senate. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell obviously opposed the tariffs, didn't hide his caucus's displeasure after a meeting with Trump administration officials about the tariffs. He professed a lack of enthusiasm among Senate Republicans for what would amount to, as according to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, a tax increase, frankly, on working class people. So there you have, and we also heard from Senator Ted Cruz. He said tariffs are not the right way to go, and there's no reason that millions of farmers and ranchers and manufacturers and small businesses in Texas should pay the price and face billions in additional taxes. Kansas Republican Senator Pat Roberts called tariffs a really awkward thing, and tariffs are like shattered glass. You never know where it's going to end, which I thought was the most interesting quote of the whole Republican Senate response to Trump's tariffs. Are they really awkward? Are they like shattered glass? You'll never know where they're going to end. I thought that was rather interesting. But the point is, the Senate Republican caucus that has been, for the most part, very supportive of this president's agenda in a wide variety of areas, was almost uniformly in opposition and in strong opposition to the president's tariffs on Mexico. Wall Street, of course, was unanimously opposed. J.P. Morgan said Trump is playing with fire. The chief financial economist at Union Bank, he wrote, "Tariff man," that's the president, "could bring down the entire world economy, all to bring back America to the days when it made its own automobiles." So there was a little bit of hyperbole, but it is remarkable to me how tariffs set off so many people into just, it's almost like they lose their minds when you talk about imposing tariffs. I mean, it sent shockwaves through Wall Street and the D.C. Beltway, and people became unnerved at the idea of tariffs, and that is just such an interesting thing to me, because for so much of the history of our country, tariffs played such an important and critical role, not only in raising revenue for the United States government, but also for protecting and enhancing and promoting U.S. manufacturing. The Republican Party was founded not only on the abolition of slavery, but also on the tariff system. The Republican Party came out of the old Whigs and Henry Clay and the American system of tariffs. Tariffs during the Industrial Revolution in America were very high, and that's when America prospered and its middle class was built. And it's just so remarkable to me that it's like the whole history of American economics has been turned on its head. And now tariffs are almost like they're almost evil. And if you express any interest in utilizing tariffs either for leverage, as President Trump so beautifully did with the Mexicans, or to raise revenue for the U.S. government, or perhaps to protect critical and important industries in the United States, the response you get from economists, Democrats, Republicans, Wall Street investment bankers, the media is uniformly opposed to them in a way that is extreme. And so I think that's a very interesting thing that we all witnessed as we've gone through this tariff, this threat of the imposition of these tariffs on Mexico. It's been quite a week, and we've learned quite a lot about where America is on this issue. That's about all the time we have today for the Mark Scarinci Show. I want to thank you for listening. Tune in every Saturday at 1 o'clock on WHP.